in the beginning of the 1990s, as the Robinsons fell under the spell of crack cocaine, a new drugs king emerged who would rise to such an influential level that he would be feted by politicians in Westminster and police officers alike. A researcher had met David St. Anthony Francis at a hospital next to Nottinghamshire Police Headquarters. The meeting had been arranged as part of a research into a television documentary about drugs, gangs and firearm problems being faced by the city in 2004. Mr. Francis, by then a veteran in the crime scene, had been out of prison for a few years. Urban legend has it that on his release, a friend arrived at the Derbyshire Sudbury prison in Mr. Francis' favourite Porsche to pick him up, but the only way that the researcher was able to make contact with him was to visit a jewellery shop in the Sneinton area and drop off a message. He responded promptly, partly because the messages had contained a letter from the former police officer who knew Mr. Francis well, and had effectively used Mr. Francis, albeit unwittingly, as an informant. He arranged to meet the researcher at the private Nottingham Park hospital, and he was undergoing treatment for diabetes. The hospital is just a stone's throw away from the police headquarters at Sherwood Lodge, a place Mr. Francis was very familiar with. He was not at the hospital when he arrived, but shortly afterwards, a phone call came through. He apologised. "I'm down at the Ferrari dealership having a look at a car, but I won't be long." The researcher thought it was some kind of joke, but then, while he was having a coffee in the hospital's cafeteria, a car pulled up. It was a brand new Bentley. From the driver's side, a bulky white man in his late 50s, who looked a bit like a bouncer, got out. But there was a pause for a few minutes, and Mr. Francis appeared, stepping almost regally out of the passenger door. It transpired that it was his own vehicle, and the Bentley dealership had provided him with a driver for the day so that he could browse some new cars down at the Ferrari showroom. After waiting a few minutes for him to make his way into the building, everyone made their way down to his room. The 41-year-old Mr. Francis, bespectacled and with long dreaded hair, lay himself on the hospital bed, kitted out with his own Versace bedspread, ready to hold court. He was keen to give away very little, but gave off a kind of special charm which you couldn't help but admire. It's been said that you can't get a much better description of him than that was given by investigative journalist Nick Davis in his book Dark Heart. "Dave positively breathes money," wrote Mr. Davis. "He wears diamond in his gold teeth. They have been drilled into the enamel by specialist dentists. Half a dozen sparkling advertisements for his success in life. When Dave smiles, the rest of the world sees his wealth winking back at them. In his ear, he has another diamond. On his wrist, he wears a heavy gold Rolex with diamond studs all around it, which he says cost him about 30 grand. There was gold around his neck, more gold around his wrists." When it was put to Mr. Francis about the media coverage, and in particular Mr. Davies' book, in which he prominently features, he said, "It's just as well I'm not the sort of person to bear a grudge, eh?" When the subject was raised about people wanting to do a documentary with him, he was less than enthusiastic. "Why would I want to do that? There's nothing in it for me. My days of all that, meaning crime, are over. I'm a grandfather now. I'm just getting on with things at the shop and keeping out of trouble." The researcher was interested in his views on white criminals, particularly as the vacuum created by his own arrest and conviction for supplying heroin had been filled by a mob known as the Bestwood Cartel, and signs were that the police were about to bring them down. "It's taken them long enough," he said. "I mean, do you think they would have got away with it for so long if they had been black? That's Nottingham police for you. I'm black, so they make me out to be this big dealer. I'm just another black guy dealing drugs to them." Mr. Francis was always quick to play the race card. When the subject was raised of his friend who had been forced to quit a high-profile job because of allegations of impropriety, he said, "Oh well, you see, he's got his troubles now just because he was trying to help out a few brothers. Don't tell me it's not because he's black." The fact was, as the researcher was to discover, that Dave Francis had done more damage to the black community in Nottingham than possibly any other individual. He grew up in Arnold, in a leafy suburb in the north of the city. By the time he was 14, he had already come to the attention of the police for handling stolen goods. He was, as a youth, very much feared at school, taking on pupils much older than him in the playground, and often leaving them bruised and battered. By the time he was a young man, he was beating up hardened thugs twice his age. The playground fights didn't always go his way though. One fellow pupil remembered an incident in which Mr. Francis almost came off worse to a girl. Dave had these huge hands which gave him the tools to be a formidable fighter. One day, this girl, who was very hard and very useful with her fists, got into an argument with Mr. Francis and launched at him. As the fight went on, the classroom resembled a war zone, and there was blood and desks and chairs thrown everywhere, and the teacher just ran off because she couldn't handle it. In the end, after her beating 7 shades of shit out of him, they called it a draw. Mr. Francis so respected her that he then asked her out, even though she said she had left him battered and bruised. By his early 20s, having moved to the Meadows estate, he was a prolific young offender and was on his way to heading the Meadows posse. This gang of black criminals, which was highly organised by 4 main leaders, specialised in armed robberies, burglary, handling stolen goods and drugs. To avoid detection, they wore Jackson 5 style afro wigs and often used stolen cars. If stopped by the police, they would admit to taking the car, but could claim that any evidence found in the vehicle, such as a firearm or overalls that matched the description of the armed raiders, must have been in the car when they nicked it. When a burglar cleared out the gun shop in Carlton, the Meadows posse took control of the Hall of Firearms. These guns would regularly turn up at crime scenes over the next decade. Later, Mr. Francis even admitted to officers that he had control of the distribution of firearms across the city. Guns are fine if they're in the hands of the people who know how to use them, he told officers. In July 1989, the gang came a cropper after a painting was stolen from a house of an 83-year-old woman in the Bilborough area of Nottingham. Believed to be a Gangsters worth £1 million, it passed through the hands of Mr. Francis and his Meadow posse. They were arranging for it to be handed over to some unscrupulous art dealer for around £300,000. But little did they know, they were in fact dealing with undercover police officers. Mr. Francis stayed on the periphery of the sale and let 2 of the Meadows posse main men, Tony Slacks and ALVIN Henry, arrange it. Mr. Slacks met the dealers, who included an undercover police officer and the police informant, at the city's Albany Hotel, and said he was willing to sell the painting for a discount price. It had been almost a year since the burglary, and the posse were keen to shift it. Mr. Slacks and Mr. Henry arranged to meet the art dealer himself at Gangsters Airport near Retford in Nottinghamshire, where the exchange would take place. An undercover officer flew up from London in a light aircraft. While the Meadows gang had no inkling that they were dealing with an undercover officer, the police were also unaware that the gang had planned to rip them off. Mr. Henry and Mr. Slacks were armed with sawn-off shotguns and had brought up flex to tie up their victims. When it came to the exchange, Mr. Slacks became suspicious and asked to see the money again. Then he realised it was a setup. "We're both playing the same game," he told the undercover officer. "That's not the money. I was going to rip you off, but you're doing the same thing." The incident descended into chaos as police moved in to arrest Mr. Slacks and Mr. Henry. Mr. Slacks was apprehended as he tried to run off, but Mr. Henry threatened to shoot some of the unarmed officers and managed to escape. He was arrested a few days later. Despite feeling he had been fitted up, Mr. Slacks was given 12 years for his part in the crime, which included possession of 2 firearms. Mr. Henry was cleared of conspiracy to rob, but convicted of firearms offences and sentenced to 3 years. The painting turned out to be a fake and was probably worth just a few £100s. The case dealt to be a severe blow to the Meadows gang, and though they had all grown up together, they began to distrust each other. Then they were caught up in another case, after attempting to rob a store in Nottingham. Again, police seemed to have inside information, and the robbery went wrong, resulting in the arrest of one of the posse, Godfrey Hibbert, an ex-boxer from Meadows, a white man called Kevin Morledge, who had acted as a dog's body for the gang. Mr. Francis called his white helpers Tampaxes because they were on a string controlled by him, and they would absorb any unwelcome problems around him. Had been approached by the police after he was arrested on burglary charges. Mr. Francis evaded the police and was very busy devising a cunning plan to destroy the police's case against the posse. He gained access to the depositions in the attempted robbery case and knew who was saying what to their solicitor and what evidence the police actually had. In Mr. Morledge, he saw an opportunity to wreck the police probe. Officers had been to see Mr. Morledge in Lincoln prison after he let it be known that he wanted to speak to them about a deal. Before they could make the follow-up visit, Mr. Francis smuggled a tape recorder to Mr. Morledge. When 2 officers from Nottinghamshire Police arrived again at Lincoln Prison, they outlined the help to Mr. Morledge, which he might receive if he gave evidence that Mr. Hibbert and Mr. Francis were involved in an armed robbery. Mr. Morledge secretly taped the conversation and then got the tape out to Mr. Francis, who edited the recording to make the case against the detectives even more damning. By the time the case came to trial in December 1989, Mr. Morledge was claiming the police had tried to get him to make a false confession in return for immunity against prosecution. The judge at Nottingham Crown Court dismissed the jury and then heard in closed sessions about the tape recordings, though the police denied making the offers and said that the tape should be scrutinised forensically to see if it had been tampered with. The judge said he had little to no option to dismiss the case against both Mr. Hibbard and Mr. Morledge. 5 years later, Mr. Morledge received £10,000 from Nottinghamshire Police as compensation. Dave Francis was once again safe, and as Mr. Hibbard had ended up going to prison anyway after being convicted of a separate drugs offence, could now crown himself king of the Meadows posse in his own right. But the fact was, by 1991, there was no Meadows posse left, or at least not as it had been. Mr. Francis was still organising the movement of stolen jewellery and gold, but had moved on to the drugs business in a big way by 1990. Though he owned a gold shop, he still made regular trips to Birmingham to see two contacts who were prepared to melt it down for him. No questions asked. Still, Mr. Francis saw that the drug business was where the money was to be made. There were two drugs which were bringing in colossal profits for those who wanted to trade. Ecstasy sales were booming. It was clubland time in Nottingham, and people were coming from London, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds and Birmingham to enjoy the sounds and hedonistic lifestyle at venues like Venus, as well as the illegal rave. Mr. Francis organised security for some events, along with nights at the Marcus Garvey Centre, which would spill over into violence when rival gangs fought it out for their neutral turf of Radford. Controlling the doors at large raves effectively meant that control of drugs going into the venues was under the gang's control. Mr. Francis's street dealers could sell pills without any worries, and he could cream off the profits. A genuine ecstasy pill, which most were coming in from factories of Holland, sold for around £20 in the UK at the time. The dealers were making huge profit. Speed was still one of the main drugs of choice in Nottingham. Some said it had been around since the days of the miners, who would take doses to stay awake on long shifts. By the late 1980s, the mines were all but gone, and the speed culture had become a recreational one. The rate of consumption during the late 1980s and the early 1990s was such that the police were often baffled when it came to them making busts. Frequently, they would discover that in a few days it had taken to organise the raids, kilos and kilos had already been sold off and consumed, suggesting a very quick turnover. Cocaine was also increasing in availability. It was already destroying the Robinson family, some who were members of the St. Anne's crew or St. Anne's Massive or Playboy posse. During his trips to Birmingham to melt down the gold that he was accumulating, Mr. Francis hooked up with the two Birmingham brothers whose feud with the Robinsons had led to Eton Green's infamous Blues Party robbery. Mr. Francis believed that he could help the brothers make inroads into the Nottingham drug scene, and at the same time helped to distribute cocaine with some heavy backers who would not fear from other traders in the St. Anne's estate. But this move, together with potential flashpoints at the nights he ran at the Marcus Garvey Centre in Lenton, meant trouble was always just round the corner. It ultimately brought him into conflict with the Yardies, and Mr. Francis decided to strike out further on his own. By 1993, Mr. Francis had served a number of spells in prison and had 30-odd convictions dating back to 1976. They included possession of a firearm, actually bodily harm, unlawful sexual intercourse, and possession of drugs. Now that he embarked on a new criminal project, building up a network of contacts who ranged from influential within politics and the police to the usable young wannabes who saw the chance of a career doing the biddings of Nottingham's premier gangster of becoming street dealers themselves. Mr. Francis was to achieve this by partly getting himself a proper job, a posting as a manager of a local drugs charity project which specialised in 24/7 outreach work for addicts, particularly those who were ravaged by crack cocaine. The charity, the Association for the Prevention of Addiction, APA, later to become Addaction, was setting up units across the country, and Nottingham addicts were among the first outside of London to benefit from the open doors of the crack awareness team to them. Mr. Francis, despite his convictions and his flamboyant lifestyle, was the ideal candidate as far as the APA was concerned. Here was an intelligent, streetwise black man with whom drug users could identify. He brazed through the interview. Former CID boss Peter Coles remembers Mr. Francis visiting him at the time. He had just been to give an interview and he drove down to the central police station and parked his Porsche up against the garages there. He was very keen to stress his life of crime was over. He said he had made £4 million by that time and he was going to be a good Samaritan now and help the community. I was aghast. I couldn't understand how this man, who was wearing an ARMANI suit, driving a Porsche, and had all these convictions, could have got the interview, let alone the job. Didn't anyone think to ask this man, dripping in jewellery, with a Rolex watch worth £50,000 on his wrist, why would he want a job as a minor social worker? These crack awareness teams are beginning to spring up all over the country. Ironically, there was another individual who had done a similar thing down North London. Mr. Francis knew this man very well through the National Drug Supply Network, and some say that Mr. Francis aspired to be someone like him, and I think that's where he got the idea from. It was a perfect cover for him to branch out into large-scale dealing. With yardies seemingly attracted to Nottingham like bees to honey, Mr. Francis was keen to avoid street dealing and the hassles that it could bring. He embraced his new role with gusto, raising the profile as a bona fide drugs worker, attending Home Office Select Committee hearings at Westminster, and the crack cocaine problem, and appearing in the ITV television documentary to talk about the problems of facing crack cocaine users. During this time, he was in fact building up his power base and recruiting people who would later become his dealers. As the main CAT worker, he would be in and out of the police cells on almost a daily basis to offer advice to addicts who had been arrested. He had also had access to depositions in criminal cases. This all provided him with useful information, particularly when it came to who was grassing up who and the police's weak point. Mr. Francis' advice to those languishers in the cell and dreaming of weaning themselves of drugs, usually heroin or crack, was come work for Dave, I'll look after you. Mr. Francis told the newspapers the government was not doing enough to solve the cocaine problem and it was blightening the city, and he sounded very convincing. He waxed lyrical. He spoke loudly about what needed to be done and how the work was to be carried out by him and his band of followers, and it was an essential part of the process. Crack cocaine users are people who have lost their houses, their jobs, sold most of their possessions, and are no longer capable of looking after their children, he told reporters. Their lives are chaotic. There is not a lot of point of giving them a 4 weeks time because they are never going to make it. For years, they are virtually denied that there has ever been a crack problem. Most of the calls we get are about 2 to 3 in the morning when people are down. The two things we don't give them is drugs and money, but we can give them food, liquid if they're dehydrated, and we can listen to their story. At times, we can help them sort out court problems, warrants and aid tests. He wasn't afraid to be controversial in his interview either. The fact is, there is a good side to most drugs. If you're telling people it's all bad, they are bound to start looking up to people who look as though they're having a great time. The issue is that there is a downside as well, and to show people that side and make it clear to them that they're likely to end up in this way, he said. It was the perfect ruse to cover his tracks, for Mr. Francis was dealing in heroin, cocaine and crack cocaine, ecstasy and weed. He was in fact one of the biggest dealers in the Midlands at that time. He'd also got a job which paid him 21 grand a year from the public purse, a job which he drove to in a Mercedes convertible worth £50,000. He also changed his BMW every year. He kept a beautiful mistress who earned a living from high-class prostitution, a house in Jamaica in his mother's name which resembled the White House, several properties in Nottingham, including a 3-bedroom house in Compton Acres, a stone throw away from his Meadows home turf, and kitted out with the latest Bang Olufsen hi-fi. A flat in the appropriately named Francis Street in Hyson Green, diamonds drilled into his teeth and gold dripping from his fingers. He was sitting on an anti-drug and child prostitution problem solving panel alongside the likes of Nottingham South MP Alan Simpson and former Chief Constable Dan Crompton, and had influence over spending of £170,000 a year from the likes of the Department of Health and other government bodies. Mr. Francis's deputy at CAT, Henry Warner, was his first lieutenant in this booming drugs empire, and Mr. Francis had also brought the loyalty of many of those going through the open door offices, or working alongside him by selling them gear or getting them to sell it for him. He was fast becoming out of reach of the authorities, not least because he had built up a wide network of influential people who were tipping off about any investigation into his activities. He was very clever. He knew the road to power and people's weaknesses, and he exploited them ruthlessly. Each time the forces of law and order got close to him, there were people willing to help him. Some were in lowly places, like the young white tampaxes who had served him. Others were in high places, some of them white middle-class individuals, willing to cry racism if Mr. Francis was criticised, and to say, "This man's a good guy. He's doing great work. We should be applauding him, not doing him down." Others began asking themselves, what does Dave Francis have on these people? What power did he wield over them that they felt an obligation to support him, when many knew or suspected he was one of the bad guys? So frustrated were the police by lack of evidence against him that they even resorted to illegal tactics to try and nail him. On one occasion, an officer arranged for a stolen credit card to be placed inside Mr. Francis's car overnight. The following day, a call was made to a local traffic police officer to pull over his vehicle. It resulted in his arrest and detention in a cell for a few hours, which enabled a warrant to be obtained to search his house and his safe, which in turn helped police gather intelligence about where Mr. Francis was actually keeping his money. But it was still not enough to nail him. He had to be caught red-handed if anything was to stick. During 1997, Mr. Francis came to the attention of the local health authority after complaints were lodged by some fellow workers who had been corrupted by his charm and wealth. They were prepared to stand up and be counted, even if it put their careers at risk. Sue Lokes and Tony Herbert were among a number of ex-workers and clients who knew what Mr. Francis was up to and could not stand to see it happening any longer. In November 1996, they went to Nottingham Health Authority, which particularly funded the crack cocaine awareness program, to complain that Mr. Francis was actually selling huge amounts of crack cocaine, heroin and weed. Not only this, some alleged that he was dealing in firearms and prostitutes. He was, they said, nothing more than a charlatan who was using the CAT project as a prop to hide his drug dealing empire. The APA launched an inquiry, but the following March, Mr. Francis had been exonerated. Worse still, he was taking retribution against those who had spoken out against him. Tony Herbert found his car vandalised. Several of his clients who had been brave enough to speak out in the inquiry received anonymous phone call threats. It was clear that dark forces were at work. How could the APA committee reject overwhelming evidence from more than 20 professional workers whose clients were on the front line witnessing Mr. Francis's actions every day? Most of them had never even met each other, so it clearly could not be tainted by association. When material started to leak out to the Guardian newspaper, it became clear just how much power Mr. Francis had accumulated. Among those speaking up for him were MP Alan Simpson and the chairman of the APA, Sir Geoffrey ERRINGTON. Sir Geoffrey told the Guardian that not a scrap of real evidence had emerged which could be backed up, and that the critics were tainting Mr. Francis's character unfairly. He was a good guy as far as we're concerned, and he is jolly worthwhile as an employee, said Sir Geoffrey. We couldn't find a spark of evidence to back up any allegation. These things were just rumours. I don't think that we have been fooled. Mr. Simpson also spoke to the inquiry, telling them that Mr. Francis was a victim of malicious gossip and at the hands of people who had their own agenda. The staff that made the allegations about Mr. Francis were threatened with legal action by the APA if it was repeated. However, by 1997, faced with a particularly damaging article in The Guardian, which outed him as a drug dealer, Mr. Francis decided to resign from Open Doors. Nottinghamshire police, in the meantime, had launched a secret operation against him, convinced there was truth in the allegations, and this time were determined to nail him. By 1998, Operation Odin was well underway. A meeting took place in the car park off the M1. In a car were two detectives from the Major Crime Unit, and they were waiting for a man who would help them unlock some of Mr. Francis's secrets. The silent stranger who greeted the two officers looked more like a down and out than the specialist operator that he was. He got into the back of the car with stealth-like ease, the two detectives jumping with a start. The mystery man spotted a tattoo on his wrist, a snake round a dagger. The symbol could mean only one thing to the detectives who were babysitting him. He was either a serving or former Special Forces operative. The car weaved its way back towards Nottingham, taking the ring road past the Queen's Medical Centre and out towards the leafy West Bridgeford. Detectives knew that Mr. Francis would be out of the way for only a few hours. He had taken his mistress to Luton Airport, where she would make one of her regular flights to Switzerland. Officers had also carried out the research on all of Mr. Francis's properties to determine which one he was most likely to provide the wealth of intelligence they needed to bust him, and what sort of security they needed to bypass to get in. They already knew that they would have to get past highly sophisticated alarm systems. There was then a small problem about a Doberman guard dog. Their target was his home in Maythorn Close in Compton Acres. Their plan was to break in, immobilise his dog temporarily, and plant a device which would allow investigators to hear his conversation. It was, of course, easier said than done, unless you had a bit of help from some extremely talented individuals. Arriving at their destination, the mysterious tattooed man was out of the car and up the street almost before the detectives had the chance to pull up. He had disappeared around the corner. Within 15 minutes, a call from a senior detective in charge of the operation made it clear that the man was on his way back to the car, having the bug planted safely. There were pieces of equipment which could break down at any time. Every month the batteries had to be changed, and at the conclusion of each operation, the equipment had to be retrieved. These mysterious specialists were invaluable. These were guys who could tell the type of key and lock needed for the property. It could be done in a mere glance. One senior Nottinghamshire officer once said, "They could also break into the most difficult locations, and you just knew that they would not leave so much as even a strand of hair behind." In Mr. Francis's case, detectives would eventually bug a passenger seat in a jumbo jet carrying him to Jamaica in a bid to learn more about his conversations. According to one very senior officer, this may be the only time a police force in the country had undertaken such a radical move to monitor a criminal target. Months of surveillance work would now be undertaken, but the validity of the material coming through the bugs would have to be tested every month in order to get ongoing Home Office approval. If there was no incriminating material on the bugs, there will be a problem gaining the authority to use the devices through the following month. The officers listened in as Mr. Francis briefed his foot soldiers. "There are people out there who would love to destroy us, so keep your eyes open and your ears open, and don't say anything unless you have to," he told them. "We can't fuck around. We've got to be the best team, the cheapest and the quickest to get the gear out. Otherwise, other crews will be on top. I don't want anything getting us into the war zone with the yardies." Mr. Francis and Henry Warner's mobiles were bugged, and every day, against the background noise of repeated cable TV soap operas that his crew seemed to have been avid fans of, they heard him organising kilo after kilo of brown heroin. Mr. Francis was only just managing to keep up with the demand of sales as they soared, partly of the consequence of the crack epidemic which was sweeping Nottingham. Crackheads found that one way to reduce the drop from their cocaine high was to smoke or inject heroin. Many were therefore fighting two addictions at the same time. Some who Mr. Francis was pimping himself were among his best customers. The crap kept them going and working through the night, and the brown comforted them when they eventually got back home. It took the pain away for a few brief hours, till they woke up and needed a toke on their crack pipe, starting the cycle all over again. Mr. Francis was making extraordinary profits, and the police knew it. 6 officers monitored conversations round the clock from the listening post in Wilford as Mr. Francis organised his shipments. He was talking to dealers in London, mainly Nigerian contacts he had built up over the years, and he was dealing with people like Ramsey Katchik, a major supplier from Leicester who had made some of his wealth from the city's notorious hot dog wars. Mr. Katchik would later be jailed for 19 years for conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. In addition, Mr. Francis had contacts in Manchester, Newcastle and Birmingham. Meanwhile, officers on the ground were taking out Mr. Francis's troops, arrested as part of Operation Odin and its forerunner, Operation Diamondback, and he was clearly starting to feel vulnerable. That would mean, it was hoped, that Mr. Francis would have to start taking more risk and ultimately get his hands dirty, which might just result in them catching him with the drugs. They could only hope for such luck. By February 1999, the end was approaching as the accumulation of material indicated that he was clearly selling heroin and cocaine on a large scale. In the final weeks of his operation, more than 7 kilos of heroin alone passed through Mr. Francis's hands. After allowing 4 kilos to go through in less than 2 weeks, the team was ready to move. They picked up information through the bugs that there was to be another kilo delivery of heroin that evening coming in a hired VW Golf from South London, which Mr. Francis has had to organise himself. Better still, Mr. Francis, running out of troops he could trust or who had not been arrested, would be at his flat on Francis Street, Hyson Green, to take stock of what had come in, weigh it and help bag it up. Alongside the bugs, Nottinghamshire police had also brought in a black undercover officer a year earlier who was so convincing he had been accepted as a trusted yardie drug dealer by the local criminal underworld and local police officers. The piece de resistance was that Mr. Francis' inner sanctum had been penetrated. Nottinghamshire police had turned one of Mr. Francis's loyal crew, a heroin addict who they had busted during a low-key operation. The tactics that won him over were reminiscent of a TV series, Life on Mars. According to one of the officers involved, he was taken to a desolate area in the dead of the night by two detectives, who then retrieved a spade from the boot of the car, pulled the petrified young man from the car and told him to start digging his own grave. He later provided important information about Mr. Francis and his movement. On the 23rd of February, police made their move. After the VW Golf arrived, carrying the heroin from London, they waited until they were sure Mr. Francis was inside his flat before they bust in. Their startled target was standing at the top of the staircase, mobile phone in one hand, thousands of pounds of cash spilling out from his pockets. Shocked he may have been, but to the officers, he appeared his usual confident self, almost as if it was a silly misunderstanding. After all, he was Dave Francis, King of the Meadows, a man everyone looked up to. Mr. Francis initially tried to make out that the drugs were nothing to do with him, and that he was renting out the flat to someone who must have brought the drugs in. He was already aware that he would be one of the last to face the court out of an army of some 150 soldiers that he commanded. Most of them had been removed from circulation over previous 9 months in operations Diamondback and Odin. Nottinghamshire police managed to get Mr. Francis only because he had believed his own invincibility and because they had painstakingly removed the tentacles of his operation from the foot soldiers up to the man himself by removing brick by brick the business pyramid which Mr. Francis oversaw. This was a tried and tested technique against a large-scale drug dealer, which usually resulted in the main man being flushed out from his or her safety zone. If the tactic worked, it would result in the target being left isolated. All around him, the network of street dealers who had previously hidden him, supported him, and ultimately protected him. There was also an issue of the assets that Mr. Francis held in various parts of the world. There was, at that time, no assets recovery unit to track down ill-gotten gains, and even if there would have been, it still would have been hard to prove in court that Mr. Francis was the true holder of these assets. It would be a further year before any kind of case came to the court. In the meantime, Mr. Francis converted to the Islamic faith whilst in prison. It meant that he could order his own prison food and have some time on his own set aside for prayer. He could also become a useful tool in the mitigation should he face conviction at Crown Court. He had used the technique once before, converting to Christianity faith whilst in remand previously. Nonetheless, Mr. Francis also believed he held good information that he could trade with the police to reduce his sentence if he was convicted or forced to plead guilty through the weight of evidence held against him. His trusted lieutenant, Mr. Warner, had already pleaded guilty at the first chance that he got, which lengthened the odds against Mr. Francis being able to squirm his way out of trouble. Whenever Mr. Francis had been arrested and he knew he was in trouble, he would always contact his favourite solicitor, said the former CID head, Peter Coles. He would let it be known that he wanted to do a deal with the police. In reality, all this meant was that he wanted us to talk him through a deal, and then he would hope that he could make some kind of use of it in the courtroom and try and sully the case against him. We got very wise to that after a while. By the time he faced Nottingham Crown Court in March 2000, charged with conspiracy and possession with intent to supply Class A drugs, Mr. Francis was ready to accept some guilt, but right up until his last day in court, he told officers he wanted a deal. The full details of that deal are not known, but Mr. Francis had planned to reveal some of the police's covert tactics in open court, which could have damaged future operations which may have led to police considering a deal. There is also speculation that he provided information on drug consignments being awaited for by other major dealers in the city. Whatever the truth is, in the end, Mr. Francis pleaded guilty to possession of half a kilo of heroin with intent to supply, another charge which could have potentially have added another 7 years to his sentence, was ordered to lie on file by Judge Dudley Bennett, jailing him for 7 years. Judge Bennett summed it all up in a sentence: "I have to deal with people day after day in this court who appear before me after committing crimes to fund their drug habit. Because of your involvement in the past with trying to stop all that in your work, you, more than anyone else, should have known the misery of the people who have became addicted." Mr. Francis, with his dreaded hair cut short and tipping his glasses backward on his face, looked like a trendy academic trying to make sense of the argument. He would be able to do this stretch standing on his head, but Operation Odin team were ecstatic. Regardless of the sentence, they were proud that the case had stuck and that they had nailed their man. The command team of Nottinghamshire's police lost no time in helping the headline makers turn Mr. Francis into the city's premier black criminal. There were red faces in Westminster too, with MP Alan Simpson admitting, "Those who said he was bad have been proved right and I was very wrong." Mr. Francis had claimed to speak for the black man in the street and had wanted to help out drug addicts. It has all been a sham. He was dealing addictive illegal drugs to his brothers and used women without remorse. His runners have the rocks that the working girls want, so he has power over them, wrote Nick Davies. Sometimes he sends them down to London, where he has friends who run brothels. Sometimes he keeps them for himself. He was the worst thing that could have happened to Nottingham's black community. He was only concerned with power and wealth. Yet, despite trips to Jamaica and investigations in Switzerland, Nottinghamshire police were unable to trace the millions that Mr. Francis had told Peter Coles he had gained. Once out of prison in 2004, he would enjoy plenty of trips to Jamaica, to the White House he had built with his sullied profits. There was a price to pay for the success of nailing Mr. Francis and his foot soldiers. The vacuum left by the removal of his operation would ultimately lead to the worst sustained outbreak of territorial violence ever seen in the streets of the city of Nottingham, and would pave the way for the growth of a white crime gang whose reputation for brutality eclipsed even that of the Yardies, and would ultimately shatter the reputation of Nottingham.